Cannibalism is one of humanity's most prolific taboos. It's one that stretches across time and culture alike. There's something about the idea of consuming what was once your fellow man that's revolting, nearly across the board, with the only acceptable circumstance surrounding cannibalism being a dire need for food. However, I'm not here to talk about the more traditional cannibal, not like what you might see in Papua New Guinea or any place like that. No, I'm here to talk about the very idea of a cannibal, the philosophy behind cannibalism. What is it you see or think of when you hear the word cannibal? Is it a man stuck in the dead of winter, huddled over his wife's corpse, sobbing as he consumes her limb by limb? Maybe it's someone being sacrificed in a ritual in some distant time to some distant god. Or do you see a freezer filled with innocuous meats in Ziploc bags? Almost invariably, you see an individual. But what about a consensus? A mob? A mass? Something swarming, convulsing, something alive. When the people shall have nothing more to eat, they shall eat the rich. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was a French philosopher of the early to mid-18th century, dying just a decade before the start of the French Revolution, one of the bloodiest periods in the country's history. Indeed, though he died a decade before the official start of the revolution, Rousseau was interred by the French as a national hero 16 years after his death for his political and philosophical musings. So what does he mean when he says, "When the people shall have nothing more to eat, they shall eat the rich"? Simply put, he means that the poor will rise against the rich. A people converging into a single mass to eat another of its own species in a sort of cleansing ritual. This idea sounds Marxist, but Marxism was invented in the 19th century, not the 18th century, and certainly not in the early to mid-18th century. This is what we can call proto-Marxism. We can see this idea in action in no better place than the storming of the Bastille, the kickoff for the French Revolution in 1789, where Parisians mobbed and stormed the symbol of their oppressive regime, the Bourbon monarchy, dismantling the infrastructure of oppression that loomed over their heads like a deadly chandelier, hanging by a single rusty chain over top of the dinner table. This mob had only one thing in mind: survival. They distributed justice the likes of which the monarchy hadn't ever seen. They swarmed the iconographic stronghold of the monarchy and sacrificed it for themselves, cannibalizing their society in the process. Their very way of life was never the same. Of course, this ideology is very proto-Marxist. We already talked about that. When used here, proto-Marxist refers to Marxist thought before Marxism, the progenitor to communism and socialism. These ideas and philosophies, intentional or otherwise, derive much of their meaning from cannibalism, specifically that of the ritualistic sort, demanding the dismantlement and transfer of the means of production from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat, the rich to the disenfranchised and poor. This idea is seen time and again in media, from film to literature to satire. The 1927 German expressionist film Metropolis plot hinges directly on these very ideas. At one point, a member of the bourgeoisie, Freder, enters the lower levels of society and comes across a factory whose workers are being exploited and worked to exhaustion. During his visit, he witnesses one of the huge machines in the factory explode, and he hallucinates the machine as Moloch, a god associated strongly with child sacrifice. In this instance, the illusion is plain as day. The workers are being consumed by the elite, another form of cannibalism whose interpretation can mean that cannibalism is both a tool of the oppressed and the oppressor. Let's take a step back for a moment. I mentioned earlier that cannibalism is present in a host of media, and mentioned specifically in satire. The piece that I want to talk about here is Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, an essay designed to satirize the Irish and British governments, as well as the aristocracies that inhabited both countries and their attitudes toward the poor. In this essay, Swift suggests that poor mothers literally cannibalize their children for profit, so as to ease those suffering from both poverty and famine, and to make useful the poor. The hyperbole used by Swift indicates incredibly proto-Marxist thought, turning the ideas of capitalistic cannibalism all the way up to 11, those same ideas that would be later symbolized in Metropolis. Swift makes mention of this very principle of capitalism in the essay itself with the line, "I grant this food will be somewhat dear, and therefore very proper for landlords, who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children." He very clearly illustrates the unethical consumption of the poor, the working class, the proletariat, by the social elite, the bourgeoisie. In this, the savage reality of society is compared directly to cannibalism, not for survival, and not for ritual, but rather just because, a sentiment echoed by Marx himself. Marx says that only a great revolution against the bourgeoisie will cause society to cease to resemble the cannibal it is today. So again, I ask, what does a cannibal look like to you? An individual or an unstoppable, inevitable mass?